In this lesson, we'll talk about some of the basics of moving around and navigating within the RealFlow interface. Okay, so let's start with the most prominent area, which is this main viewport. So to actually move around within RealFlow's 3D space, that's done by pressing and holding the Alt key on your keyboard, and then using your 3 mouse buttons. So Alt left click will orbit and move my camera around. Alt middle click will basically pan my camera from side to side. And then finally, Alt right click will zoom in and out. Okay. Now, when it comes to actually moving around within this viewport, you can see right now we're looking at just a single view. Now, RealFlow does have orthographic views, things like top, left, and front. Now, there's a couple of different ways of moving back and forth between those. We could actually switch this from a single view to a quad view. So if I come up to this single view menu, click on this first little icon, we could switch this from a single view to something like a quad view. Now you can see we actually have our perspective view, as well as our top, side, and front. If we want to get back to a single view, just take one of these and just switch that back to single view. Alright, now we also have keyboard shortcuts that we can use to jump back and forth between these. So 1 is going to be the top view, and you can see this is now labeled top. 2 is front, and again, we can see that label up here. 3 is side, and then finally 4 takes us back to our perspective view. So a couple of different ways of actually moving and jumping back and forth between your different viewports. Now, as far as the actual interface items are concerned, we'll be talking about these in a great deal of depth as we start to progress a little bit further through this course, but just a few things that you'll probably want to be aware of right from the get-go. Let's start by just dropping in maybe just a couple of simple objects. So within RealFlow, we have these first row of buttons right up here. So if I click on this little yellow cube, this is actually where we start to bring in geometry, some of our basic primitives. So if I were to start with something like, let's say just a simple cube to begin with, you can see here's our cube piece of geometry, and again, we can move and orbit around that. We also see that this cube has showed up in our nodes list. So this is essentially just a long-running list of every single thing that we have within our RealFlow scene. And as we start to add new things in, let's say something like a little rocket, for example, that's one of the primitive objects that we have in here as well. You can see that, again, here's the object within our scene, and it also shows up in our node list, so we can select our objects from here as well. Now, as far as the actual viewing of these objects, you'll notice that right now we are pretty much just looking at this in a wireframe view. Now, there's actually several different ways within RealFlow of actually switching this back and forth between something like a wireframe or a shaded view. So, for example, we could go all the way up to the View menu, go to Scene Shading, and set the entire scene to be smooth shaded. We could also do this exact same thing by pressing the keyboard shortcut, which is 0. And now you can see that everything in my scene has been switched to this shaded view. And we could set this all back to something like wireframe, using the exact same methods. So again, set that back to a wireframe. You can see we also have things like bounding box and flat shaded. And again, we have keyboard shortcuts for all of these, so we can quickly jump back and forth. So if I were to press the 8 key on my keyboard, that takes us back to a wireframe. 0, again, takes us back to a shaded view. We can also do this on a per object basis. So if I had an object selected, I could go to View, Element, and then just set that single selected element to something like wireframe. And now you can see this cube is now shaded, but this rocket is now a wireframe. We could also do this through these little buttons right up here, so this is a quick way of switching on a per object basis, whether this is displayed maybe as a bounding box, or maybe just as a wireframe, or maybe as just a basic flat shaded. So you can see with flat shaded, we start to see these really, really sharp faceted faces. And we can also set that back to a smooth shaded as well. And again, these will control this on a per object basis. We can also start to select objects and either hide them by pressing on this little button here. And you can see, again, that object's been hidden. There's no way to actually grab that here within the viewport. However, we can still grab it and select it within this nodes list. So I can still take my object, select it, and then come back and tell RealFlow to make that object visible again. So again, this is a second way of controlling this. We also have some of these same features built into RealFlow's right-click menu. So if I were to right-click anywhere in this open space, we can, again, go down to things like our scene shading and switch all of that. We also have a few additional features in here, things like the zoom, zoom selected, and center. These will control our basic camera movements. So let's say I had my camera back a little bit further away, and I wanted to very quickly pull my camera in on this little rocket ship. So with that selected, I can just right-click, go to either zoom or center selected. Now if I go to center selected, you can see it will just take the object and put it right in the middle of my viewport and center my camera right on that, but it won't move my camera any closer. However, if I right-click and go to zoom selected, it will place the object within the middle of my viewport and bring the camera all the way in close to that object. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson is the transformation tools in RealFlow. So we have our basic select, move, scale, and rotate buttons right within this top menu. So if I had my rocket ship selected and switch to my move tool, you can see works just like any standard 3D program. We can grab our object and move that around any 3 axes. We can also rotate that object. And if it comes to actually moving our object, we can actually switch this between a local and a global axis mode. So you can see right now with this rocket ship rotated, if I were to switch back to my move tool and try to move that, you can see it's moving it along its local orientation. But sometimes we may actually want to take our object, rotate it, reorient it, but still move it along the global axes. Well, within RealFlow, we can do that with this little button right up here. So clicking on this will switch us between a local mode and a global mode. So now with this option pressed, you can see now we're moving it right along the global axes. If we go back and reselect any object, it will again remember this. Now it actually remembers these settings on a per object basis. So you notice if I click on the cube, it sets us back to this local mode. If I go back to my rocket ship, you can see it still remembers that it was in a global mode whenever we last had it selected. So really pretty nice the fact that RealFlow can remember that on a per object basis. Now in addition to just simply using our manipulators to move and reorient our objects, we can also do that through this node list over here. So essentially whenever we have an object selected, all the attributes that control either the visibility or the behavior of that object can be found within this node parameters. So if I were to select my rocket ship, all the way up at the very top in this node tab, click on that to expand it, and now we have access to things like this object's position, rotation, scale, and so on and so forth. So we can come in and grab something like this object's position, and let's say we wanted to move it, let's say up 1 unit in the y-axis. You can see we can now come in and start to type this and get a little bit more precise if we ever need to. We can also, again, do the exact same things with rotation, scale, and so on and so forth. Okay, so really this has been just a quick look at some of the major interface elements that you're going to need to be familiar with really from a very early point on as you start to work within RealFlow. Now there are still several areas that we have yet to talk about, and again, we'll be talking about these as we start to progress a little bit further through this course. So with that, in our next lesson, we're going to now start to get into some of the processes and some of the workflows involved in simulating RealFlow's fluid particles.